doesn't act. And I think it's hard to put into words how extraordinarily reckless and irresponsible Senate Republican leadership have been here. The House passed the HEROES Act 2.5 months ago. And until last week, when we were right up against these deadlines, Senate Republican leadership refused to even start negotiations on a final bill. This isn't a game. These are people's lives, and people are suffering. You only have to talk with your coworkers, your clients, your neighbors, or open up any paper, turn on the local news, and you can see the heartbreaking impacts of this inaction. Families are being evicted. They're lining up to wait for hours to get into a food bank because their kids are hungry. Families aren't sleeping out of worry over how they're going to pay the rent that's overdue and what they'll do if they become homeless during a pandemic. It doesn't have to be this way. This eviction wave is not only predictable, as we have been predicting it now for 4.5 months, it's entirely preventable. Congress needs to act immediately to establish a national moratorium on all evictions for non-payment of rent, provide at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, provide $11.5 billion in funds for homeless shelter and service providers. It's that simple. This will stem the tide of evictions in our country. All of these provisions passed the House over 2 months ago. There are bills in the Senate for each of these provisions, and some of them, like Senator Brown and Schumer's bill for $100 billion in the emergency rental assistance, have near unanimous Democratic support. And so here we are over the cliff with all eyes on Congress to see if they can reach a deal in time to prevent untold harm to millions of Americans. And we need to keep the pressure on them, the pressure to act. The negotiations are moving incredibly slowly, but they do seem to be making some progress. Democrats are staying very strong in keeping our priorities at the top of their priority list for negotiations, and Republicans are starting to come around. Thanks to your advocacy, there's at least a dozen Republicans that have weighed in with Republican leadership to say some protection for renters has to be included in a final bill. Really? So thanks to the advocacy that all of you are doing, the Republicans and the Democrats, I think, understand the urgency and feel the pressure to act. And so we have to keep it up. We have to do more. I know we're all tired. We're in the middle of a sprint at the end of an ultra marathon after doing this intense level of advocacy and work for almost 5 months now. But while the final deal is very uncertain and unclear, we're closer than we've ever been to getting rent relief now. And so we have to keep going until we achieve it. Failure is not an option. The stakes are too high. And so today's call will hopefully give you a lot of motivation, some ideas, some inspiration for your advocacy. And I want to turn now to our first speaker, who I'm so pleased to have on the line with us, and that is Senator Mazie Hirono, who is a senator from Hawaii. Senator Hirono was the first female senator from Hawaii. She's the first Asian American woman elected to the U.S. Senate, and she has been very active in calling for housing and homelessness resources and protections in the next relief bill. She is an original co-sponsor on the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. She joined with Senator Warren on a bill to prevent and respond to outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness. And she again joined with Senator Warren on a bill to extend and expand the federal eviction moratorium to all renters. She's also very focused on long-term housing investments. She introduced a bill, the Pathway to Stable and Affordable Housing for All Act, that would effectively end homelessness through investments in the National Housing Trust Fund, full funding for rental assistance, expanded funding for homelessness programs. So she's truly a champion for the issues that we all care really deeply about. So Senator Hirono, thank you so much for your leadership, and thanks for joining today. I'll turn it over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Diane. And I want to thank all the people on this call. I thank you for your advocacy and all the hard work that you've put into what we need to be doing in Congress. The fact is, and Diane, you described everything very well. The Senate Democrats have been, with a sense of urgency, ready to negotiate the next COVID bill for over 2 months now. after the House passed the HEROES Act. And as I say, we have a sense of urgency about what is in store for our families and workers, renters and others if we do not act quickly. But the Senate Republicans certainly have not shared that sense of urgency. In fact, one of the first things that Mitch McConnell said was, we should take a pause, as though the millions of people who are unemployed, no paychecks, all of the people who are waiting in long lines for food at the food bank and all that, as though they could afford to pause. So they took a pause, all right. And then only recently have they come up with a number of individual kinds of bills. It's pretty piecemeal, in my opinion. It doesn't go nearly enough, not by a long shot, on the kinds of support that the Democrats have wanted, and much of which is already in the HEROES Act. And so they're coming at it from a very different perspective, one that places a lot of emphasis on supporting corporations over workers and individuals, especially in Mitch's position that he needs to insulate corporations from any liability that is even vaguely, not even vaguely connected to COVID. They would like to protect corporations from liability. What does that mean? Corporations would not have any incentive to create safe workplaces or to protect people who deal with these corporations or customers. That is where the Republicans are. And I'm glad that you mentioned that there are maybe a dozen Republicans who are saying that we need to provide some rental relief. Really, I would be happy to know who these Republicans are, because so far it's not as though they've been standing up on behalf of the people who are really going over the cliff in terms of housing. In fact, a number of Republican senators have taken the position that they are done with any more COVID bills, that they've done enough, seems to be their perspective. I don't know what world they live in, but it's certainly not the world that you all advocate for or that I fight for. So as you say, we are negotiating. It would help if Mitch McConnell would get into the same room with Nancy Pelosi. My understanding is he is reluctant or has up to now not done that, and so we're negotiating with Mnuchin. I say, okay, we will negotiate with whoever has the power and the authority to move the Senate Republicans. So that's where we are. And my hope is that we will get something done that includes the support that we need to provide for the emergency solution grants. That would be a total of about $15 billion for those kinds of grants that would go directly to helping the homeless. $100 billion for rental assistance. That would be, I believe that's also in the HEROES Act. And we have to continue the $600 in addition for the UI benefits, because that is literally a lifeline for these workers and their families. And that money goes to pay rent and all the other necessities, including food. So, you know, that money is circulating in our economy. It is quite astounding to me that Republicans take the position, at least too many of them, take the position that this additional $600 is what somehow being frittered away, or again, I don't know what world they live in, that they don't realize this is a lifeline for all these people who are facing extended periods of unemployment. So thank you for your advocacy. We will continue to push for the kinds of real relief that people will need, but we are facing quite the challenge with the Republicans, and not to mention the president, who has provided absolutely no leadership in terms of facing the pandemic or the economic crisis that resulted, not to mention the systemic racism in our country that's also being evidenced, you know, of the people who are really suffering the most during this pandemic. So I'm looking forward to whatever questions you all may have. You just need to keep the pressure up. This is no time for us to, I realize we're all exhausted emotionally and otherwise from the battles that we've had to fight for the last 3 years and more, but this is truly the time for us to work even harder. And also, you know, elections matter. So I know that all the people who are on this line know that we should be voting for people. I'm not telling anyone who to vote for, but I mean, truly, we should be voting for people who share our priorities. with regard to housing and all the other issues that I know your listeners care about. Diane?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Hirono. I appreciate your comments. And given that we're already past so many critical deadlines, and
Yes.
that negotiations are happening, and just knowing how urgently solutions are needed, what would you advise that people on this call do to continue to keep the pressure up over the next week to get to the solutions that we need?
You know, I'm pausing because unless you have people making decisions who share our priorities, you're not going to have these issues addressed in the way we want. And that's why when I say elections matter, it is really important for everyone to get the word out as to how important it is for everyone to vote. And people need to draw the appropriate conclusions and as to who to vote for. And it has to be people who share our priorities. Otherwise, it's just going to be that much harder. And particularly, there are some vulnerable Republican senators out there. Maybe some of them are the ones who are saying to Mitch McConnell, we need to provide some rental assistance. Those folks need to continue to hear from all of you.
Yeah, and we certainly plan to continue urging those Republicans that have already weighed in on the need for rental assistance to keep doing it, and to urge additional Republicans to do so as well. So one other question for you, Senator Hirono. After we achieve the short-term solutions we need to stem this tide of evictions and keep people experiencing homelessness safe and get them quickly housed, of course, we have much more work to do to address the long-standing and underlying affordable housing crisis that we were in even before COVID-19. And so your legislation, the Pathway to Stable and Affordable Housing Act for All Act would do that, would address the long-term changes that are needed. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that bill and talk about what you think the outlook for it is and how we can work together over time and in the next Congress to achieve those solutions as well.
Stable and affordable housing has been a need throughout our country for forever, it seems. We need to provide sustained support, not just a one-shot kind of funding. We need to sustain our effort. So the Stable and Affordable Housing Bill would provide, or would call for, $10 billion a year for the emergency solutions grants, $10 billion a year for the continuum of care grants that would enable more people to move out of homelessness into shelter, $40 billion a year for the Housing Trust Fund so that we can expand affordable housing in our country, and then fully fund the voucher program. So these are all approaches and ideas that have been around. It's just that there has not been the political will and the kind of pressure put on decision makers to provide a sustained effort to address the issue of affordable housing in our country. And certainly in Hawaii, we know about affordable housing and how hard it is to find, because Hawaii is one of the we are among the highest cost of living states. So it makes housing even more expensive, not to mention that we have a finite amount of land. And so for any number of reasons, but you know, the pathway to stable and affordable housing is, the way I look at it, it is a blueprint. And it's a lot of money because we've not been paying very much attention to the need for affordable housing forever in this country. But it's a blueprint, and I think that any substantial moves that will address any of those funding issues that are laid out will be a step forward. But it has to be sustained. It has to be a sustained effort on everyone's part.
Yes, absolutely. And we appreciate your leadership in introducing that bill. It's a very important piece of legislation, and one that we wholeheartedly support and look forward to continuing to work with you to move it forward. So thank you again. I really appreciate your leadership on these issues and appreciate you joining today's call. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you all. I want to thank all of you for your advocacy, because there aren't that many people who really advocate for the homeless population. And there are a lot of people that are only one paycheck away from being homeless, not to mention all the people who will become homeless because we are not extending the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures and providing real support for affordable housing. So thank all of you for your advocacy. Do not get tired. This is a time for all of us to not only get woke, but to stay woke. You have to stay the course. Thank you very much. Aloha.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Okay, we'll turn now to our next section of the agenda, which is to talk a little bit more in detail about what's happening on Capitol Hill with the negotiations, what progress we're making with Republicans and Democrats towards our solutions, and what more we need to do to actually achieve them. So we'll start with Sarah Sadian, VP of Policy at NLHC. Sarah, please go ahead.
Great, thanks. Just to build off of what the Senator and Diane led with earlier, we know that congressional leaders and the Trump administration officials began last week to have formal negotiations over the next coronavirus relief package. There were several days of impasse, but over the weekend, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, Speaker Pelosi, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer reported back that there had been some limited progress, which is promising, and I think shows that there's interest on both sides to get something done. We might see, although things seem very slow, maybe from the outside, we know from past experience that these sorts of negotiations can move very quickly. And it's very possible for Congress to reach an agreement on this COVID relief package as soon as this week or early next week. We know this because both House and Senate leadership, they've expressed an interest in reaching a deal before members of Congress leave for August recess. They both have an interest in being back in their districts so that they can prepare for the upcoming elections. And while we know that Democrats and Republicans are very far apart on some of the key pieces that will be negotiated in this bill, we also know that there's widespread interest in having some bill at the end of the day. So adding to that pressure, as Diane mentioned, is the expiration of the expanded unemployment benefits and the federal eviction moratorium. Members of Congress on both sides are concerned about, have expressed to us concern about what this means for renters. I also want to build on what the Senator said about and Diane, about the impact that your advocacy is having. We are seeing that members of Congress are in a very different position than they were just a few months ago on the need for emergency protections and resources for renters and people experiencing homelessness. Diane mentioned that we know of at least a dozen Senate Republicans who have weighed in with their leadership or weighed in with the Senate Banking Committee on the need to prevent evictions, including the need for rental assistance and an eviction moratorium. They are increasingly expecting to negotiate over those provisions with Democrats and are starting to think through what their position will be when it comes to those negotiations. That's a long way away from where we were a month or two ago, where it was more difficult to have Republicans weigh in about the need for these resources. We are also seeing Democratic leaders really hone in and focus on the need for renter protections. They're doing this in their public conversations with reporters, on C-SPAN, on the Senate floor. We're seeing a lot of activity on the Senate, especially the Senate Democratic side, focusing on the need of these resources. And maybe surprisingly, to me at least, we saw President Trump even call for a short-term extension of the federal eviction moratorium. And while that's not sufficient, we need to see that moratorium expanded to cover all renters and extended to provide long-term assistance or long-term protections for renters. It is very remarkable that the president has made this one of his top priorities for the next bill. He's even threatened to take executive action, bypassing Congress if he needs to on the moratorium, all of which means that as Congress is putting together this deal, all of the things that we have been pushing for is very possible and very much on the table. That means that everything from the amount of assistance that is provided, who is helped, who is targeted to receive this assistance, that is all up for discussion, in large part because your advocacy over the last couple of months have made that possible. So in this last week or two of what's likely to be negotiations over this bill, this is really the time where we need advocates to be hammering home that message to both their Democrats and Republicans in Congress that we have to have really robust housing and homelessness resources and protections in this next package, and that these resources must be targeted to serve people with the lowest incomes who have the greatest needs that we're seeing in our communities. As a reminder of what we're all pushing for, we've been calling for a national uniform moratorium on evictions to cover all renters for non-payment of rent. We've been calling for $100 billion in emergency rental assistance through Senator Brown and Representatives Heck and Waters' bill called the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. We're pushing for $11.5 billion to help address the health and housing needs of people experiencing homelessness, and at least $13 billion in additional resources for housing stability. I'll share that information in the chat box so that you have it with you. But as Diane and the Senator said, this week and next week are really the most critical times where we can make the biggest difference in what is in this next bill. And I encourage you to seize that opportunity and make sure that your voice is heard. Thanks, Diane.
Sarah. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to turn it right over to Joey Lindstrom to talk about the needed advocacy and further steps you can take in your communities on our priorities. Joey's the Director of Field Organizing at NLIC. Joey, please go ahead.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Sarah, for your wonderful thoughts on the importance of advocacy. That leads really naturally into what I'm hoping to share today. First, I want to say to everyone kind of two things. One, Sarah is right that there are a lot of senators and several Republican senators who have moved a lot since this conversation began, since the passage of the HEROES Act 2.5 months ago, specifically on the matter of rental assistance and the $100 billion we're seeking. We saw some moderate Democrats who we thought would never be so bold as to join the $100 billion rental assistance standalone bill eventually sign on. And when we see progress like that, you might assume that 4,000 constituents reached out to them, but in most cases, it's really more like 12 constituents reached out to them and set up meetings with the housing staffer or sent a thoughtful email about what rental assistance will mean for their community. Please know that senators are moving and becoming more comfortable to our asks, and that's the result of your advocacy. And also please know they might be doing it quietly for now. I think there are a lot of senators who are saying publicly that they want to draw a line on spending, but are very open to supporting renters in some of the ways that we're proposing. But they have to be quiet about it because they don't want too much backlash within their caucus. So know that even if you don't get an immediate response of support as a result of your advocacy, that doesn't mean you're not making progress by advancing these arguments. I'd like to address just a couple of common responses that people are hearing from their members of Congress when they're doing outreach right now. One of them that can really halt advocacy in its tracks is when a member of Congress or a senator says, "We're with you, we're supportive, we're on board," right? We're in a moment right now where having as many supporters as we can get is wonderful, but we need those supporters to also be advocates themselves within their own caucus and to the leadership of their party. Because right now, so much of what is happening is negotiation between leadership. And so when a member of Congress or their staff is saying, "We're on board with all of your asks," the next ask is, will you communicate your support to leadership who is negotiating the final spending package? That's a really important second level advocacy that we hope many of you will be carrying forward. Next, what you'll hear from a lot of members of Congress, specifically Republicans, in some cases is, we support renters, but isn't the unemployment insurance enough? And we really insist that this is a false choice and that unemployment insurance is really important. for households to meet their basic needs. And rental assistance allows that unemployment insurance to go further and to apply to more things, such as medication and food and educational expenses and necessary communications and so forth. Sarah just posted into the chat box on this topic a really wonderful document that was put together by NLIHC on why unemployment insurance itself is not enough. Please do use that resource. Another response you'll hear from members of Congress and their staff is, you know, we support renters, but what about the debt, right? And one thing that we often say is there's always creative ways to address the debt through ending tax cuts or cutting spending in other moments or in other places. But in the moment of emergency, in a moment of crisis, it's important that we provide what people need to keep them alive, as more than 150,000 Americans have died already from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I finally want to address some of the offices who might say, because they're very worried about the debt, isn't an eviction moratorium enough? Do we need rental assistance? Or they might say the opposite. Can't we just do rental assistance and not do the eviction moratorium? But the truth is, we need to think of these two solutions the way we think of salt and pepper. Like, they are two things that travel together. They are always a pair, because we don't want to invest $100 billion in rental assistance that goes directly to landlords who then a couple of months down the road will proceed with an eviction anyway. We also don't want to move forward with an eviction moratorium that just delays when an eviction might happen, because renters then have rent arrears accumulating that will be owed promptly at the end of such a moratorium, right? The eviction moratorium and the $100 billion of rental assistance are both essential solutions and should be thought of as complementary to one another. So those are a couple of the responses that we've been hearing from people who are doing the advocacy. If you haven't yet reached out to your members of Congress, please do so. If you have reached out, please do so again to further strengthen their support, to follow up with more information, or to ask if they have any questions as the negotiations move forward. I encourage you all also to please be creative about the numbers and different members of Congress you can reach out to. We got an email last week from someone who works in Danville, Illinois, but lives in Indiana. And she was saying, you know, maybe she could reach out to senators in both states, which we were really excited to hear. Be considerate, consider not only who represents you as an individual, but also who represents your work and the community that you serve and so forth. Because the more members of Congress that you can touch with your advocacy, the stronger our collective effort will be. That's it for me, Diane.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Joey. And I'll turn now to Lisa Marlowe, who's NLIHC's Manager of Media Relations and Communications, to share some communications tools and tactics that you can use as well. Lisa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. So just to piggyback on what Diane, Joey, and Sarah just said, we are running out of time, and America just can't wait. This weekend, Diane was actually on MSNBC with Candace Gibson, talking about how if Congress doesn't act now, we will see a tsunami of evictions and an increase in homelessness. This isn't a threat, it's a reality. We must continue to do our part to make sure Congress knows that it is unconscionable and unacceptable to allow people to remain unhoused or to lose their homes during a pandemic. So resources are available to help continue this communication. You can sign up to receive NLIC emails so that you can receive calls to action in real time. You can sign up for those emails on NLIC's homepage. You can do some social listening, retweet, repost stories on Twitter and Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., that demonstrate the urgency. You can follow NLIC on Twitter and Facebook and engage on posts. You can follow NLIC's In the News in memo to members and partners for a quick snapshot of published news articles on these topics. You can continue to use NLIC's advocacy toolkit from Virtual Lobby Day on the 21st to schedule virtual meetings with your representatives. Now, when you schedule those meetings or when you call your representatives or email them, when you're reaching out to them, be sure to share reports like the Out of Reach report. or peer review articles on the connections between housing and healthcare and how emergency rental assistance contributes to one's overall well-being and provides an opportunity to create a foundational support for families with young children to thrive. I know that Allison from Children's HealthWatch will be on later on this call to talk about recent articles on that topic that you can share. Also be sure to share published op-eds and letters to the editors that detail the local connections and impacts. Share this information on social media using the hashtag #RentReliefNow. Tag your members of Congress when doing so, and also don't forget to tag reporters to also flag that, we're aware of this urgency and the need, and ask your members of Congress and reporters, what are they planning to do about it? What's the next step? What actions are they taking to stem the tide of evictions and an increase in homelessness? Use NLIC's social media toolkit. That's available at nlic.org/rentreliefnow-social media toolkit to get sample tweets, sample images, and possible content for an op-ed. Diane and Sarah mentioned that your advocacy is having an impact. Democratic leaders are continuing to focus on the threat of evictions, and we are hearing from Republican members of Congress about the need for emergency rental assistance. But we have to continue the drumbeat. We can't let up, and we have to use our entire network, partnerships, and communications tools to make sure Congress knows that inaction has consequences. Families, low-income homeowners, renters, they just can't wait. House Democrats have passed 2 significant pieces of legislation that supported everyone to be stably housed during and after the pandemic. We must continue to communicate to the Senate, especially Senate Republicans, they should immediately enact those essential housing provisions and protections that passed the House over 2.5 months ago. We hope that you find the NLIC communications tools useful for doing that. And that's what I have, Diane.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. Really helpful. And a good segue now into the next part of our agenda, which is we called Advocacy Spotlight. So, we have so many tremendous national, state, and local partners working with us in this effort to achieve rent relief now. And so we want to take an opportunity to spotlight some of their work and also have some of our national partners talk about some of the ways they're approaching advocacy on these issues, to share ideas, share tips, and inspiration for what more you may be able to do within your organization, within your community. So first, I'm going to turn to Bethany Snyder, who's the Senior Comms Strategy at Community Solutions. So Bethany, thanks for joining, and please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane, for inviting me to be here. So again, I'm with Community Solutions, and we are a national nonprofit that is working with specific communities across the country to end homelessness and the conditions that create it. So you might have heard about us through our Built for Zero initiative. And these are those over 80 communities working to end homelessness. We work with continuums of care across the country to help them put in systems in place to make sure that homelessness is rare and short-lived. So when it comes to advocacy, this is very new to Community Solutions. We are just starting to dip our toe into advocacy, and we're new to the advocacy sector. So when we started thinking about this, we thought, where can we have the most value add? And further, we had been hearing from our community partners that they had an interest in getting engaged in more advocacy efforts. They saw that there were opportunities in their community where there were barriers, policy barriers, that were impeding their ability to solve homelessness in their communities. So when we started thinking about how can we be, again, what is our value add? What are our strengths? And so we really want to start with our communities and start with those easier asks. So because there is so much action happening at the federal level right now, and there's so much work being done, we thought, well, we can leverage this work, we can build upon it, and we can engage our communities in it. So one of our first things that we considered is that we have deep community connections. In the 80 communities that we're working in, we are regularly in touch with the community leads, the community partners, and many of these folks, and many of you are on the line today, hello, are community leaders. They are seen as experts in the community and have strong relationships with other organizations and with local and federal electeds. We also wanted to be highly strategic and targeted. We do not have a large grassroots network to engage, but again, we have specific people in specific communities that are already experts and understand this issue that we could leverage those strengths. So I worked with NLIHC to look at their target list and thought, okay, where do the targets overlap with our communities? And we have great community partners in Colorado, North Carolina, and Arizona. And I included Iowa on the list because to be completely transparent, I currently live in Iowa and I grew up in Iowa. So I felt like if I am asking other people to do this work, I should do it as well. And so I use it as an opportunity for me to get to know my senator's office as well. So we organized virtual lobby day with these 4 folks and with their staff. And one of the things we realized is that we are going to need to create advocacy resources. While many of our partners have been engaged in advocacy, they may not have been engaged in this way or may not have been following these issues as closely as we have. And so one of the first things we created was an advocacy webpage. And this is where we have housed our call to actions and a lot of our resources around advocacy, including we have fact sheets on the different pieces of policy that we're asking folks to engage on, sample emails and phone scripts. We also realized that training and prep was key. And so I made sure that we got all the folks who are going to be on the lobby day visit on a preparation call where we could go through the agenda. We could talk about how it was going to roll out, and just so they were prepared for that. But one thing I want to talk about, one of the things that we really focused on in our meetings with the lawmakers was on our folks' stories. So our community partners are engaging with the people experiencing homelessness in their communities every single day. And as I told them, anyone can submit a fact sheet. Anyone can talk about the policies and the statistics, but what they can't talk about is what you're seeing every day on the ground. And so how I teed up the meetings was I started off each topic. We're talking about emergency rental assistance or the moratorium or ESG grants. I started talking about, okay, this is our ask. This is what we're asking of your boss. But then I would turn it over to a community partner to say, can you please share with McSally's staff how this is really, what is happening in Arizona and what you're seeing in your community? Or can you please share with Tillis's staff what you're seeing in North Carolina and the tsunami of evictions you're expecting? And I really focused on giving that, that really personal, that really personalized story from their states that they could not hear from other folks. And then I wanted to make sure that they knew that we're going to be doing follow-up. I followed up with each staffer, and then I also share that information with each attendee and ask them to follow up. And my goal is I want them to create relationships with these staffers. So in the future, or this week, if those staffers have questions about these policy issues, they have a person to go to in their community, that they will come to us as a trusted resource, and we'll come to them as a trusted resource on these issues. And so I'll be following up with those people as well later this week, the Senate staffers that we created relationships with, as well as these attendees. And so that is just a high-level overview of how we engage in advocacy. And if your organization is thinking about it, some ways you may want to think about as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bethany. That was really helpful, and I appreciate all the great work that you're doing and appreciate the partnership. And thanks for sharing those tips. We had a couple of requests to share the slides, so we'll be sure to do that in our follow-up email after this call. So thanks for joining, Bethany.
Thank you.
So I'll turn now to Allison Bovell-Amon, who's the Director of Policy Strategy at Children's HealthWatch, to talk about some of the amazing work that they've been doing. Allison, please go ahead.
Thanks, Diane. So Children's Health Watch, we're a network of pediatricians and public health researchers committed to improving health equity and improving the health of children under the age of 4 and their families by informing policies that alleviate economic hardships. And so we do our work first by conducting research on the front lines of pediatric care, where we talk to families about their ability to afford basic needs. And of course, one of these top of the list for families is their ability to afford housing and to remain stably housed. And so during this crisis, we have been particularly concerned about the impact that housing instability and homelessness have been having on families. And while we have a number of, sorry, I was trying to switch slides. While we have a number of publications on this topic, I did want to highlight a couple of them that we have published since, thank you, that we have published since the beginning of the crisis. So this first publication recently came out, we did with our colleagues at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, really highlighting the domains in which housing impacts child health. And I cannot emphasize enough that all of these domains are being impacted by COVID. So they are the ability to afford housing, which is often linked to stress and of course downstream eviction and other factors of instability. Stability, when families are moving frequently, when they are forced to leave their homes, and the literature around that, and child health. Quality, there's of course a very large body of evidence around quality and health, and we know that children, with a lot of the stay-at-home orders we're hearing in our clinics, that quality issues are of course being exacerbating child health because they're spending more time at home. And then neighborhood. And of course, we've seen in a lot of the analyses around how housing instability and this COVID crisis are intersecting, the pandemic and the virus itself are intersecting, are exacerbating all of these issues. And so we really are calling for bold federal solutions in these domains, not just in the current packages, but really in order to promote equity over the long term. This second piece is a blog that we wrote for the journal Health Affairs, really trying to encapsulate some of the ways in which housing instability impacts people's ability to remain healthy, especially during this pandemic, and of course how this pandemic is exacerbating health inequities, particularly racial health inequities. And then finally, I want to highlight, as Lisa mentioned earlier, this piece that just came out on Friday by my colleague, Dr. Megan Sandel, who wrote this with two of our colleagues at the Boston Children's Hospital as well, around this looming crisis of homelessness among families with children. And we are particularly concerned because not only does the literature point to, obviously, the long-term health impacts, life-altering, in many cases, health impacts of homelessness during childhood, during this crisis, but we are already starting to see families report health-related conditions due to housing instability and homelessness during this pandemic, which of course are concerning at baseline at any time, but they are deeply, deeply concerning at a time where our health systems really need to be ready to respond to the pandemic itself. And so this is really compounding a lot of those issues. And I see that there is a request to share the links to these. I can also provide the links for these articles as well. And so Children's Health Watch, we conduct this research in order to inform policy advocacy. And so we've been working with NLHC and other partners around really comprehensive solutions to support families with children, recognizing that families with children and families with young children are impacted by economic stability over a much longer period of time than recessions often last. Families who have low incomes, we know from previous recessions, continue to struggle with an ability to afford basic needs well after the economy as a whole recovers. And so one of the main pieces that we're advocating for is really around housing, but we also see that these are in concert with other policies, many of which have been mentioned already today, that stabilize families, both in the short term to get through this crisis, this economic crisis and this pandemic, but really we need long-term solutions to promote equity as well. And then what I'd like to end on is we are having a virtual town hall tomorrow to go deeper into the racial inequities and how this is impacting health inequity across our nation. And so I will include the RSVP link in the chat if anyone is interested in joining our town hall. But we will have Yentel Wilkinson from the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign and the National Low Income Housing Coalition, as well as a local organizer here in Boston, Lisa Owens with City Life Vida Urbana, and Dr. Thea James, who's an emergency medicine physician and vice president of mission at Boston Medical Center and associate chief medical officer at Boston Medical Center, talking about this sort of looming wave of eviction and what that will mean for the health of communities, particularly Black communities, now and in the future. And we do hope that all of these tools can be useful for your advocacy efforts and really elevating the ways in which this isn't just about housing. Here in this pandemic where health is really front and center of a lot of our conversations, housing is also a health issue. And so we really need to take these priorities seriously and implement the solutions that go upstream, that the National Low Income Housing Coalition and all of you are advocating for in order to sustain the health of our country.
That's great, Allison. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your great work and your partnership, and appreciate you joining. There were requests, as you said, several requests for the links to the articles that you mentioned. So if you get a chance, please put them in the chat box, and then we'll certainly include them in the follow-up email that we'll send out to all participants as well. Thanks, Allison. I'll turn to our next speaker, Emma Marabi, who's the Director of Poverty Policy at Children's Defense Fund. Emma, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you to everybody at the National Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting us to speak. We're happy to be here and appreciate your leadership and your partnership over the years. I just wanted to start, since we have so many people on the line, and just give a brief overview of the Children's Defense Fund. For those of you who don't know, we are a national nonprofit based in DC, born out of the civil rights movement. And we have 6 state offices: Minnesota, California, New York, Texas, Southern Region, and Ohio. And we actually, I think similar to, or not too dissimilar to what other folks are talking on the call, we actually have been working on advocacy for more than 40 years, but we also have our direct service part as well. So we're a pretty unique, I would say, double nonprofit in DC. And for over 40 years, we've worked to provide a strong, effective, and independent voice for all children in America who cannot vote, lobby, or speak for themselves. And we pay particular attention to children of color, children living in poverty, and those with disabilities. And so, in our minds, advocating for housing justice and racial justice is really part and parcel to the work that we do each and every day. And I think for us, we've made that need for robust housing assistance very prominent in our advocacy work around the coronavirus relief packages, because we really do believe that housing is a human right, and it is foundational to the well-being of all children. And when we don't have that, especially for children of color, we often are tasked with children who are going to be a lot less successful in later life. And so, this, over the last several months, we've published several briefs and blogs, which I'll get into in a moment, but I did want to make sure that everybody knew about our asks. which are very similar to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're asking for the $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, the national, moratorium on evictions, and at least $115 billion in emergency aid for people experiencing homelessness. We've also pushed for additional money for the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth program to help children experiencing homelessness get access to the education materials and other supports they normally get at school. And we've advocated for this on our blogs, on our letters to the Hill, in our emails to staff and the like, I think several times over the last several years. And some of the things that I think we focused on in many of our outward-facing materials and our inward-facing materials, because we are a children's organization, is really the unique needs of children right now. I think, like many of you, we are deeply concerned, and we've seen this a lot, I think, both in our communities, when talking to people and knowing what's happening in schools, but also through the Census Pulse survey, which I know many of us on the call, on this call use, but the fact that kids are feeling this double whammy, right? Not only is housing and racial justice an issue, and it has always been an issue, but even before the pandemic, right, 1 in 3 kids live in households burdened by exorbitant housing costs, and 1.5 million children experienced homelessness last year alone. And even last week, the most recent Census Pulse survey data showed that close to 30% of all adult renters who live with children said that they were behind on their rent. And that's up from 26% the week before and earlier in July. And that's troubling. And I think so often we talk about the unique needs of families, or maybe we talk about workers, but we often really do forget about kids. And so for us, we've tried to center our conversations on that a lot more, and always have. And even last week, I think some of you probably saw this, 8 million households with children are behind on rent. And again, that's the most updated Census Pulse survey data. And so we've tried to, like I said, update our briefs. I will actually throw these into the chat for you all, so you have it. In June, we published a brief about housing, how housing is a racial justice crisis and how it deeply impacts kids' success. In July, we published a blog post explaining how a failure to help renters could lead to a massive eviction crisis that could leave millions of children without a home. We also used this post to directly communicate with Senate offices who weren't on Senator Brown's Emergency Rental Assistance Act. And we actually also, within those emails to staff, we used state-specific data on evictions. And so when we would send the emails, we sent them our blog posts, and then we also sent stuff about, like, if in case your boss doesn't know, like these are the thousands of people, in your state who are at risk of eviction because of that state-specific eviction, either expiration or already expiration, since so many states have already had their state evictions expire. And then on July 21st, we were very pleased to partner with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Opportunity Starts at Home campaign for a day of social action on housing priorities. And that was part of our 2-week-long campaign on action on kids. And part of that was born out of Mitch McConnell's, I'm sure many of you saw early, I think it's sometime in June, before they wrote the HEALS Act, had said, the Senate's going to focus on kids and the economy. And so we wanted to make sure that, Mitch McConnell and the rest of the Republicans knew what focusing on kids really meant. And we've also made sure, just within our advocacy, that not only are we doing this online and digitally, but in our calls, we've brought up all of our housing asks and our other calls on tax credits and the need for cash assistance and TANF, because all of these issues are very intersectional. And then lastly, last week, we also sent out a new action alert telling the Senate, telling people to reject the Senate HEALS Act and instead get to work on kids. And one of our top asks is all of our housing asks that I had mentioned before. And I will also drop those in the chat so folks can see them. And happy to answer any questions.
Great, Emma, thanks so much. I appreciate all your really good work and the partnership as well. And I appreciate you being on the call today. There were several requests, which I see you're already on it, to put links in the chat box. Thank you. And we'll share those links in follow-up.
You're welcome.
Oh, thanks, Emma. All right, we'll turn now to field update to hear from some of our partners throughout the country about what's happening in their states and cities related to COVID-19 housing and homelessness. And we'll start with Rachel Stucker. She's Executive Director of the Housing Alliance Delaware. Rachel, thanks for joining. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone at the National Low Income Housing Coalition for giving me a few minutes to talk today about what's currently happening and been happening in Delaware. Housing Alliance Delaware is a statewide housing and homelessness policy agency here in Delaware, and we are also the Continuum of Care lead for the Delaware Balance of State COC. I'm just going to provide a brief update on the issues of eviction and rental assistance in terms of what has been happening and where we currently are here in the state. So we were one of the earliest states, I think, to launch a rental assistance program, thanks to the work of the Delaware State Housing Authority. They launched DHAP, the Delaware Housing Assistance Program, on March 26th. So going back feels like years ago, with a pot of $5.6 million in state and local funding, with contributions to that fund being made from various jurisdictions throughout the state, which was very exciting. And at the same time, a moratorium on evictions was put in place by the Justice of Peace Court here in Delaware, which oversees eviction proceedings. The rental assistance program received over 5,000 applications in a 4-week period and was closed down due to that high volume and the need for the Delaware State Housing Authority to focus on administering and processing those 5,600 applications. To date, a little over 1,000 households have actually received rentals and utility assistance through that program, which we're calling, or I'm calling, DHAP, Delaware Housing Assistance Program 1.0, version 1.0. And as I said, it's been on hold since the end of April. So where we are now is that they are preparing and have been preparing this entire time to launch Housing Assist DHAP 2.0, as I am calling it. And the eviction moratorium was lifted, the statewide eviction moratorium here in Delaware was lifted a few weeks ago, much to many people's surprise and concern. But a couple of good things coming out of this. So the eviction moratorium was lifted, but the courts are actually not holding or scheduling any eviction hearings. They're only accepting new filings at this time. So they haven't actually begun processing or hearing eviction cases or claims. In addition, they placed some additional criteria on what it would take for an eviction to be to proceed with an eviction and to actually proceed with kicking someone out of their apartment, which would be that they use language that it must be found by the court to be in the, quote, interest of justice to do so. We have yet to see what that means in practice. But the courts have put a number of things in place to try to help. Of course, we were hoping they would not lift the moratorium, but as I said, they're not holding hearings, and they're actually working to launch this second round of housing assistance in directly in connection with the eviction process through the courts. So we're expecting that there will be at least $14 million available at the restart of the housing assistance program. Much of that coming from Delaware's CARES Act relief funding. The new design would be that it is connected directly to the Justice of the Peace Court. And what the court has said that they're intending to do once they do start actually processing the new filings is they're going to be launching an alternative dispute resolution program requiring that landlords and tenants, if it's a non-payment issue, and if the eviction was filed after the state of emergency was put into place in March, that they will be required to go through an alternative dispute resolution program. And if the tenant is eligible for that rental assistance through the rental assistance program, that the landlord will be expected to or required to in some form or fashion accept that payment and not evict. So we are waiting to see how that plays out. We are hopeful that it will be effective. The idea is that landlords would apply directly, would be required by the court actually to apply directly to the Housing Assistance Fund, this 2.0 version, to have the back rent paid if the tenant is eligible. And eligibility right now is looking like 80% below area median income and some kind of COVID impact on their income. So it will be limited to that population. This is unlikely. You know, there are still some big concerns. One is that the alternative dispute resolution program, that folks might fall through the cracks if they don't have representation or legal help. So there are ongoing discussions here about how the state or jurisdictions, or even with some CDBG CARES Act funding, there might be an opportunity to fund legal assistance so that all tenants going through the alternative dispute resolution program as part of the eviction process will be provided with legal assistance. We're also concerned that the $14 million won't be enough funding to cover the need, but we are also waiting. You know, one of the reasons that the court has indicated that they're holding off on scheduling hearings and proceeding with any new hearings on evictions is to get a look at the data as the filings are coming in to try to better understand what the need will actually be. And we're hoping that we have a very close relationship with our legal aid advocates here in Delaware who provide representation for tenants. And we are hoping to be able to have access to data on the filings to understand what the need will be and use that information to advocate for additional resources if those become needed. In addition to the housing, the rental assistance program that is, as I described, being put into place to be connected directly to the courts and the eviction processes. We also have our local HUD jurisdictions with CDBG funding, looking at ramping up funding for homeless prevention activities so that folks don't end up having evictions filed against them in the first place, and actually having those two rental assistance buckets flowing, one through the courts and one through homeless prevention providers as they normally would, but with significantly increased funds through the CARES Act CDBG funding. So that is where we are in a nutshell with rental assistance and eviction proceedings. We are cautiously hopeful, and I would also say remain concerned, given that the moratorium was lifted, but cautiously hopeful with the work that our courts are doing in partnership with our legal aid advocates and with our housing authority to get this assistance flowing before proceeding with the actual hearing of evictions. One last thing I will mention is that there has been, as there has been in many communities, a lot of coordination around the use of this HUD CARES Act allocations under the CDBG and ESG programs. Used a lot of that funding, first round of funding, to provide hotel and motel rooms for people experiencing homelessness, support ongoing shelter operations and PPE to our shelter providers, and already have invested quite heavily in additional rapid rehousing resources here in the state for people and families experiencing homelessness. Lots of coordination, lots of investment. Things have been going really well there. Nonetheless, we still have about 200 folks, according to our most recent data from Coordinated Entry, which is statewide here in Delaware. We still have about 200 folks at any given time who are reporting that they're unsheltered. And here in Delaware, we really have a very limited street outreach. So we remain very concerned. Our congregate shelter for people experiencing homelessness remains at about, we're looking at that regularly, again, through our coordinated entry system. Our congregate shelter remains at about 50% of its normal operating capacity due to the necessity to meet public health guidelines and keep our congregate shelters safe. And we are really still working really hard with our local HUD jurisdictions to get those funds to the people who need them and to get those folks safely sheltered as quickly as possible. There was a lot of really strong upfront coordination, an emergency crisis-oriented outreach initiative that the state implemented, which was wonderful. But we're getting to a place now where we're seeing that much more needs to be done, and it's the local infrastructure to plug some of the funding into is requiring some significant capacity building. But we're still working at it and are, as I said, cautiously hopeful, and I'd say at the same time, remain concerned and are very thankful for everything that, all of the information that everyone is providing to us here locally from the national level. Your help and expertise and ideas have been absolutely critical to our work, so thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really great work that you're doing, and was a terrific overview of it. I appreciate you taking the time, and I will be very interested to see the data that you're able to access on eviction filings. I think that will be incredibly important, as you say, and a good model for other states to have similar kind of partnerships to access that data so that we can track the challenges and the needs in real time. So I look forward to hearing more about that from you on future calls. Thanks for joining, Rachel.
Thank you.
So we'll turn now to Kate Watson from Kansas Statewide Homeless Coalition. Kate, please go ahead.
Yes, hopefully everybody can hear me okay.
Sounds perfect, Kate.
Yay. Okay, well, thanks for having me on the call today to talk about what we're doing in Kansas related to the COVID virus. And I just want to throw out a kudos to Lisa and all that they're able to do, especially the great partnership that you have with the state. So just that was a pretty exciting presentation I heard and was inspiring for us as we are in this almost dead center of the country. And this is where we're starting to see spikes, not only in the major states that you know about, but we are the balance of state. For Kansas, we cover 101 of our 105 counties, and the 4 that we don't cover are the highest population centers, such as Kansas City, Kansas, not to be confused with Kansas City, Missouri, that is the largest part of Kansas City, if you're not familiar with our area of the country. But in the balance of state, most of our COC covers like low population centers, rural counties, and frontier counties that constitute 6 people per square mile. So fortunately, those are the areas where we have the lowest rates of COVID. Currently in our state, we have about 12,000 cases, which is really low compared to a lot of places in the country. But last Friday, there was 942 cases, new cases that were reported with 9 deaths. So the problem is here in Kansas that out of those numbers, we don't have a really good way other than anecdotal information to report on exactly how many of those folks are homeless or at risk of being homeless. So thanks to the National Low Income Housing Coalition that provided us with funding to support the work that we are trying to do. And we started out using a lot of that funding for hotel vouchers for those who were homeless, so they could be in a stable place that's out of harm's way. And those who were suspected of having COVID, to get them quarantined. So that was extremely helpful, and we were grateful for that funding because we are one of the lower funded COCs, but we're moving up steadily with help from organizations like the National Coalition that we're talking on today. So the numbers of those hotel vouchers that we were using across the state, Those numbers are still coming in, so we don't have like any totals. But what I can report that's very different and unusual for our office is that, and I've been here about 5 years, and all of those 5 years, in this past 6 months, I've received more phone calls and emails along with my team several times or more a day for people who are being evicted because they've lost their jobs because the moratorium was lifted, and those that just have nowhere to go and they're completely homeless and need a safe place to stay so that they don't get sick. And it's really sad, and it's difficult for us in such a large span of our state. Just to give you an idea, if you were to go from the northeast part of the state driving to the southwest part of the state would take 8 to 9 hours. So we're covering an extreme amount of geography. And so as you can imagine, there's very limited resources in many parts of our state. And a lot of folks that are homeless don't want to move to a different part of the state. So we're trying to meet them where they live and do the best that we can. And so on a more positive note, and I want to kind of piggyback off what Lisa Marlowe was talking about earlier about linking homelessness and healthcare. And we are really looking at the social determinants of health and getting some policies in place. And I guess this is most of my career was spent in public health and working on preparedness teams for Ebola and H1N1 pandemic. So I understand how this works, and I'm trying to get the message out that we really need to connect with our healthcare partners. We're already connecting with our state and local healthcare systems. We have more work to do there. But one of the more positive impacts we were able and starting to make with the funding that we got from NIHC is using some of that money for adding COVID modules to our HMIS system. So just coincidentally and probably just bad luck and bad timing, we went from an older HMIS system that just was not working for us in terms of the clarity of data and the just the useful of the data that just towards the end it was really not quite useful at all. So we switched to a new system just about the time in March when all of this was ramping up. So we have been able to make sure that we have a system now where we can track these COVID cases so that we will be in a better position to make decisions that are evidence-based interventions as we move forward, because knowing how pandemics work, this is not going to go away tomorrow. It's not going to go away in a year. And I'm even looking out to a year or more that we are going to have to be dealing with this. So I'm just coming from my experience with my previous colleagues at the CDC and NIH that have also been suggesting these dire outcomes unless we do something more and better. And I think that Lisa did a really good job of describing some of the things that she's doing. We are on a positive note as well, being reached out by our media across the state. So we've been able to do a number of interviews on television and radio to kind of get the word out. We have reached out to our legislative folks with not much response yet, but we are resilient, and I just can't thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition enough for some of the help they've provided and tips and things that we can do. We're a very small staff here with only 3 people, and we are trying to grow so that we can do more of this work because things are getting worse, not better, in terms of our outcomes related to COVID in the state. But we are very tenacious, and I think that as we move forward, particularly with getting a data system that really gives us the information that we need in such a large geographic area so that we can really hone in on the places that need our help the most. So I just want to stop and say thank you for listening. And if folks have any suggestions to offer the state of Kansas, we're totally open to that. And so thank you again for taking time to listen today.
Kate, thank you. Thanks for all of your really good work and for the partnership. I appreciate you joining the call to share that update. I'm sure you'll hear from some of our partners. Your contact information is up on the screen and will be shared with in the follow-up information. So thanks for your good work and thanks for joining, Kate.
Thank you.
And now to our final field update for today's call, which comes from Thomas Adams, who's the Executive Vice President of Housing and Services at Common Bond Communities in Minnesota. Thomas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you for to the National Income Housing Coalition for inviting us to speak today. I'll talk a little bit about what has happened here recently in Minnesota. Common Bond is a mission-driven property developer and property manager for about 13,000 residents covering Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and soon to be South Dakota. We recognized early on some of the challenges of residents being able to support themselves. And so we started way back in March with a broad coalition of tenant advocates and landlords and local housing associations to press for rental assistance. We asked the governor for $100 million, and his proposal was for $10 million. And through the end of the legislature, into a couple of special sessions, we were not able to get that passed. As you can probably understand, we were the epicenter of the civil unrest here in America with the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis. And so as we were pushing to get some sort of relief from the state, to get the the eviction moratorium extended, just was not able to happen before the legislature went home. We found that just recently, as July 30th, about 8% of our rental receipts, we were down about 8% compared to last year. And overwhelmingly, it's about 14% in our subsidized properties. And so we were just having a very difficult time. We decided that we would not evict tenants, even when the eviction moratorium was lifted in Iowa and Wisconsin. We made the decision to not evict tenants for lack of payment as a result of COVID. And so we were really, really advocating to get some relief. The governor used some of the CARES fund and dedicated $100 million about 2 weeks ago to rental assistance and rental relief. So we're very, very excited about that. It's called here the COVID Housing Assistance Program, so CHAP. So we're excited about that. Our concern is that it's not enough. When we look at the housing assistance programs in Wisconsin and Iowa, which border Minnesota, we're already seeing that they are at capacity with about 25 to 30% of the need being met. The other piece that we're concerned is the $100 million here in Minnesota can also be used for foreclosure prevention. So it's not all just rental assistance. So we are involved in advocacy in support of any federal bills and assistance for rental assistance. We ask for everyone to continue to advocate and support those, because in our portfolio, we're very clear that the $100 million that came from the state, while needed and necessary, is not going to be enough. And so, so with that, that's just a quick update as I look at the time with what's happening here in Minnesota.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Really good work, and appreciate your focus and dedication on getting resources to low-income renters at the state level and the federal level. And I appreciate this update today. Thanks for joining the call. So with that, we are through our speakers for today's call. I do want to share a few next steps, and one answer to a question that came in from Gina Wiltz in Ohio at Cohio. And she was asking what I think a lot of us are asking, which is that local or state or federal policymakers aren't seeing these mass eviction issues yet, and so maybe don't feel the urgency, even though we all know that those evictions in some places have already started and that many more are still to come if Congress doesn't act. So she was asking how we get policymakers to take a proactive approach on this. And there are a few things that we have been doing in this cases, and one has been to track the evictions that are already happening and share that out with policymakers in the places where the state and local eviction moratoriums have lifted. In many cases, we are seeing increased evictions, and we find that through local media reports, through stories from legal aid attorneys or from renters themselves. And so we compile that and share that back. That helps us make the case both that evictions are happening and are likely to increase as eviction moratoriums expire and as rental assistance programs expire. It also helps us make the case that expanded unemployment insurance on its own isn't enough to prevent the eviction wave that's otherwise coming, which is another argument that we often hear. If we expand the unemployment insurance, won't that be enough to prevent evictions? And the answer is no. Expanded unemployment insurance is very important and should be extended, and has very likely prevented millions of renters from being evicted yet. But we know it's not enough on its own, because even with the expanded unemployment insurance in place, evictions are increasing and rental assistance programs are being depleted. So the other thing that we have been doing that I hope to be able to share on next week's call, and we'll share as soon as possible if we have it ready, but we have been working with some economic projectors, modelers, who are helping us make the case and determine the cost of evictions. So the cost to landlords in lost rent, and the cost to state and local governments in because of lost taxes paid on local properties, and so on. So we're working to pull together these numbers on a national level and also for some states, and Ohio will be one of those states. And we'll share that out as soon as we can. So other next steps that I wanted to quickly touch on is, one, the most immediate next step is, I hope you're convinced from this call that the first thing you should do when you hang up is call your member of Congress or send an email. Even if you already did it yesterday, do it again today. And if your member of Congress is supportive of our priorities, tell them thank you, demand that they continue to keep it as a priority, and ask them what more you can do. And if your member of Congress is not yet supportive, urge that they become so, and demand to know what is their answer, how will they prevent this wave of evictions. I also wanted to remind you of all of the other calls that we are hosting at the National Income Housing Coalition throughout the week. Our next Tenant Talk live call, which is primarily for low-income renters and hosted by NLIHC's Kyle Arbuckle and Renee Willis. That next Tenant Talk live call happens today at 6 p.m. And Keith Swiney is our guest speaker today. He's going to talk about leveraging resident management councils. Tomorrow on Tuesdays, and I believe it's 12:30, we have our regular legislative working group calls. Those calls are co-facilitated by Joey Lindstrom and Sarah Sadian from NLIHC. That's where we'll talk much more nitty-gritty details about targets on Capitol Hill and what the latest is in negotiations and what we need to be doing to push our priorities forward. Also on Tuesdays, every 2 weeks, we have a Working with FEMA call that's facilitated by Noah Patton. On Wednesdays at 3, we have our state and local implementation calls with Kim Johnson and Tori Bure. And so feel free to reach out to any of us at NLIHC in order to get involved in any of those other calls. You're free to join as many or as few as you want throughout the week. Also, please be on the lookout for calls to action from us at the coalition. Things are likely to move fast soon, and when they do, we'll start sending out calls to action with what the latest, what we know about what Congress is or isn't willing to do, and what more you all need to do to urge your member of Congress to do the right thing. Finally, I will just mention that we are keeping a close eye on Hurricane Isaias, as our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition will continue to monitor all hurricanes and all disasters and be ready to respond towards an equitable disaster response if needed. So much more to come. Thank you all again for joining today's call. Thanks for all your partnership and good work. And thanks so much for your advocacy. Please keep it up. We have so far to go, but we are closer than we've ever been, and we have to be successful. So please keep calling your members of Congress. Thanks so much. Talk to you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.